Imagine having access to a tribe of mentors, experts in the biggest questions in tech. This is Making Revenue Tick.
So we've actually just finished recording the episode. Michael, for people just joining us now, what are they going to hear about in the next hour?
Well, hopefully they will learn a little bit. If you are a leader in Europe, if you are looking to land a company for the first time, it may have zero revenue, it may have some revenue. If you're looking to learn from some of the failures and also successes that I've had and also Richard has had, I think you might find some value in what we talked about today.
100%. We're also going to talk about, should you hire an AE? What level of manager should you hire? Should you bring existing talent over? What are the differences? What would ultimately make someone successful in that role? And whether you should just hire someone who's been there, done it, and got the t-shirt with all the success stories, or whether someone's got the vulnerability to share the mistakes. So without further ado, let's roll the VT. Hello and welcome to Making Revenue Tick, our masterclass format of the main podcast. I'm joined by someone that I've grown very fond of in the last few weeks, Michael Schirrmacher. Michael, how you doing?
And I'm good. Good to see you again.
I said your name with like a lot of emphasis there. It's quite a badass name.
You did. And it's funny. I'm so used to people either getting it wrong or trying really hard to get it right and then getting it wrong. And then I pretty much always have to spell it at least 3 or 4 times every single day. So yeah. But you did all right. You did. I'll give it a 9 out of 10.
Amazing. I'll try it again. I'll fluff it up later on. Obviously, so Michael, we've had some brilliant conversations since we met a few weeks ago, introduced by our good friend James Bissell, who I know you've worked with. And we've there's so many things that we could talk about because your experience is so rich, but there was one that we landed on. What is the topic that you want to talk about today?
Yeah. So I think we both talked about this and had a bit of a laugh about it, but also it's something that I've done more than once, and that is thinking about how you land predominantly a US business, because that's been my personal lived experience, but really any business here in the UK or in Europe, and the types of things that you need to think about as a sales leader. So I think it's almost like a do's and don'ts.
Okay. I like it. The do's and don'ts of landing in Europe. Yes. I think this is going to be fascinating. So, I mean, I've got some experience of this as working in an outsourced go-to-market agency where we had all these different European languages under one roof, and we were often working with US businesses. So we were often the people that delivered that or like did the incubator and set it up. So it's going to be really fascinating to hear your perspective from the other side of that.
Yeah,
because I've seen a lot of mistakes made myself, but I haven't solved all of those problems myself, and I'm really interested to hear yours. I think when you talk about that topic, landing in EMEA, what it makes me think of is the number one type of original brief that I would get from a client is, "Hey Richard, we're a Series A business. We've got a good penetration in the US. We want to really expand into Europe now. We just want to get a salesperson, maybe find one in Dublin, or maybe find one in London, or maybe in Amsterdam. And then we'll build a team around them." So like this idea of like hiring a single salesperson to break open a whole region or a whole continent. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. Well, it's such a funny one to start with, isn't it? Because that is often the assumption. If you're in the States and you think, right, we're going to open the UK, which is normally the landing position for obvious reasons. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've seen it, and I've definitely seen it and corrected it a few times where they've just hired an AE, and it's literally sink or swim time for that individual. So I think that was one which really stood out to me as being just a mistake. I'm going to say it straight out there. I would advise anybody to absolutely avoid that at all costs. Okay. So here's why. Okay. You've got to put yourself in the position of that individual. All right. Particularly if it's a US company, even at Series A, they're going to have, 25 to 50 people already. They'll have some customers already. They'll have some kind of motion, product market fit. And you have to put yourself in the mind of that AE who has probably think they've won the lottery by getting this amazing job, should it happen. But then you sort of stop and think about, well, what does that mean for that person? You sat there in probably your home office, because you're not going to hire an office for one AE, that's for sure. You're 5,000 miles away from all of your colleagues. And whilst we've all worked remotely and with US teams for a number of years, it's that sort of loneliness and kind of solo commando effort that really makes it really, really hard. So I actually saw it and walked into it where the company had done that before hiring me as a leader. And we just had to correct it immediately, because what tended to happen, and which I'd love to hear if this is the same as what you've seen, is people would make a little bit of success. They'd get very, very excited, but then very, very quickly they'd realize that they don't actually have that support day in, day out. They don't really have the ability to replicate what's going on in the homeland. Okay. Yes, I appreciate things have got a bit easier with sales intelligence tools and all that sorts of stuff right now. But it is so hard to break a region as an AE. And I think I would always advise people to do it the other way around. Hire a leader. It doesn't have to be the most senior leader known to man, but hire a leader and then get that leader to build a team from underneath them. It tends to work so much better. But I am curious, because you probably see this like week in, week out, like you say. Like, are you advising people the same way?
Yeah, I'm fascinated to hear let's just talk about the leader side first, and then I'll jump in. So what is it about hiring the leader first that is an advantage over hiring the rep?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, you've just got a macro lens on everything that you're doing. So, hopefully, if you're hiring the right leader, they've done it before. Okay, that would be the first thing. So they know where the pitfalls are. They've actually launched a region before. They understand the types of questions and the impact that they're going to be driving. Really, a leader's primary responsibility is, and should always be, to hire well. So they're also thinking about the long term. They're thinking about growth, not just in terms of the revenue, but they're thinking about growth in terms of the team. And I think for me, that's the standout difference. An AE just does not mentally think like that, because their role is ultimately to hit their targets. So it by design is a very, very selfish setup, which is fine for that individual. But when you're the first person in a region, having a VP just means that immediately you've got that umbrella-like thinking. So people will be looking at growing the whole as opposed to the single. And I just feel quite strongly, having seen it really fail a few times by hiring the AE first, that it's just not the way to do it first, even though it's very tempting and cheaper.
This is, I mean, obviously the number one driver, right? Like we're dipping our toe in the water. This human, we'll send them in first. So, but I'm curious to know, like, could you just paint the picture for us? Like, could you, like an example of specifically what went wrong when you tried before, so people can learn from it?
One case I'm thinking of, which I walked into, and as I said, had to correct as the leader. The AE in question had been in seat, I think, for about 18 months. Okay. And this company that I was at, it was a few years ago. They were probably doing about 15 million in the States. They had a number of really big customers. And I think the challenge that this AE had, even though they were very good, they were genuinely very good. They didn't have local solution consultant support, and it was a really technical SaaS product. So immediately they're on the back foot, right? So on a kind of call or meeting that they were having with customers, they're not only having to explain the rationale of what this was, because it was basically creating a segment, but they had an SC dialing in from the States. And, whilst you can get away with that on a few individual calls, as long as they're well prepped, if that's the case with every single call you're doing, I think the impression that it was giving was to the customers, you're not really that serious about our region, And I know that's hard to say, because it can work and you can get deals over the line by doing that. You definitely can. But I think in this particular instance, we were going after very large customers and very high ACV first. It was a kind of whale hunting mission. And it definitely made it harder for that person. And I think the other thing is, it was in sort of my heartland, which is, I've worked in e-commerce and retail for a long, long time. I think particularly in Europe and the UK, it's actually a very close-knit community. And particularly for that community, at least, I can't speak for other areas in tech, face to face and actually taking a market seriously, it does count for something. And whilst this person, they did get a few wins on the board, it just wasn't really sustainable. And there wasn't really any tailwind that was following the work that he was doing. So there was no talk about getting extra resources in region. There's no talk about how we actually expand the team, get an office, all of the things that, by the very nature of the job, they wouldn't think about because they're just thinking about revenue.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. I think it makes it. I think what happens in the mindset, particularly of the US founders, is that they think of it like another state. It's just another state. We just put someone in there, like the sort of territory model. But the reality is that if you're hiring someone to break into a new geography where different cultures, it's almost like a founder, really, isn't it? And what percentage of startups fail? Like 90% in the first year, another 90 of those in the second year. So unless someone's actually got experience as an entrepreneur and the level of resourcefulness and ownership and collaboration and execution that you have to have, I don't think that person is going to be set up for success, particularly if they're a founding AE. Very likely they've been an AE from your industry who knows your market. So they're probably used to a completely different level of resource. And they'll be really attracted to it. You'll always hire someone, always, because it's no management, get to be like in control, much more freedom. The payoff, I can become the leader. Often that would be the promise, right? You get a bunch of equity and then we'll grow a team around you if you make it. But maybe they've never even been a leader. And we know that gap from IC to leader is one of the biggest gaps that exist.
I think you make a really good point, and I will pick up on it in that they are often promised the leadership role, but I've very rarely seen that happen. More often than not, you'll get the AE kind of limp along for a few months, and then the company will realize they do actually need a leader. And they'll always hire the leader in above that AE, and the AE actually never quite makes it. So that tends to lead to a disgruntled employee and some tension. And so I think all in all, it isn't worth doing. But you make another good point in that the leader in any region, if it's a European company going to the States, it would be the same thing. That person has to represent and be the face of the company. It's so important. And I think for that reason, it is quite a different role.
Let's talk about that, because you mentioned obviously VP, and when you were talking about hiring a leader, my mind was going to manager first, but you're going straight to VP, maybe even like GM level.
Yeah.
It's probably going to have its own P&L, right? If they're running it as a proper business experiment with its own resources assigned to it, it should have a P&L. What's your thoughts around this level and where it's optimized?
I think for anybody listening, particularly for the European leaders out there, this will be something that just is a constant battle. Okay. Some organizations really understand it well and they empower the individual that's leading the region. But more often than not, what I see is the matrix structure becomes quite rigid. And let me give you an example of what I mean. So the classic structure would be chief revenue officer reports to the CEO, and then underneath that chief revenue officer, you may have, for argument's sake, I'll make it simple, you may have a head of East Coast, head of West Coast, and then a head of Europe based in London. Okay. And those three individuals will always be pegged as peers. All right. But then when you peel it back, what are those individuals doing? Well, the head of the East and the West Coast have basically got the same job. They'll have a team of AEs underneath them, supported by solution consultants working with the CSM team. But in Europe, I don't care how neat people want the boxes. The job is different. And I think the best CEOs and CROs, they understand that, and they'll maybe give that individual in Europe a bit more freedom, because ultimately, whilst you are still responsible for revenue, and you are peers of the head of the East and the West Coast, you are doing a lot more than they are. You are, like it or not, your job is to be the face of the company. Your job is to look at all of the administration stuff. Your job is to deal with all of the HR side of things. Your job is to be the dotted line manager to all of the other departments that may have a manager somewhere in the US, for example, customer success, solution consulting. There may be some HR people there. And I think the companies that understand that the best are the ones that will see their European leaders really, really flourish. The ones that don't understand that, there will be friction. And it can make it really, really hard, because it is a different role. And certainly when I've done it myself a number of occasions, I like to see myself as really being the face of the company in Europe. And that is the reality, because you're also doing all of the public speaking, all of the events, all of the, the seeing is believing, perception is reality, all of that stuff. And whilst the CEO represents the company vision and will be, leading that, I do think you have to channel that as being a European leader and take that really, really seriously. So yeah, I would say hiring a VP or a GM should absolutely be a consideration when thinking about these types of roles.
I guess the other side of that level of person is that they will have built systems. And if you're thinking about East Coast, West Coast, maybe even central heads of sales, VPs, whatever you want to, wherever the level is, they will probably be utilizing the same system, same resources, same RevOps team, same marketing. It will be similar because the industries will be similar in terms of the way they operate. And often they might carve it up by industry rather than even just verticals. But in Europe, because the industries are different, the companies are different, the way they work, their needs, the competitors are all different. It needs a different workflow. And if you're hiring, like it's an IC, they might be able to figure it out. So we want to hire people with a high figure it out score, as a lot of people have as a criteria, or adaptability as it's also called. What you actually really need is people who can have success and systemize it and rapidly fail and realize what they failed and then write that down because you don't want everyone coming in and making their own mistakes. And if you hired like a team of rogue individual contributors, they'll figure out their own how to be successful, but you can't scale from a base of individuals working to their own operating systems. You need like an OS that the region operates under, which has to have systems, metrics, and measurements, which an IC would naturally always try and avoid. They would just say, hold me accountable to the number. I don't want you to be getting in the detail of my work.
That's exactly right. And I think having done it before counts for a lot as well. And just understanding that it isn't necessarily the same as home turf as well. There are idiosyncrasies and differences, languages, all sorts of things that people just don't have to think about potentially coming from the States, which that sounds ridiculous because it's such an obvious thing to say. But I can see you're laughing. You've probably heard this 1,000 times. The amount of times this comes up is just astonishing to me. So, but it's,
it's hilarious. Well, what it made me think of is the amount of times that someone says, could you find someone who's also bilingual German? Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Oh, easy. What you want them Spanish, German? Oh yeah, we can do all of it in one person. Of course that person exists and you can afford them within this salary bracket. That's hilarious. I think this would maybe be a really nice opportunity to just introduce your history. I know you've got lived experience of these roles, which is why I was so attracted to do this podcast with you. Could you just talk us through the most relevant experience that you've got around this topic so people can kind of piece this in their mind?
I'd be happy to. So I've been in leadership roles in SaaS companies for a really long time now, probably since 2008. And I followed that classic route of just being an IC. And I many years ago, gosh, back in 2003, this is making me sound very old. 2003, I was working in what we used to call email marketing, which is now it has a much better term now. It's called campaign management, which sounds much posher. So I was an IC for a company for 5 years there, which is a German-based company. So I'd actually unusually started with a European tech company. Then I worked for 5 years at an absolute classic company that many people who are old like me will remember, which is called Web Trends. And that was where I moved from being an IC to a manager, which was just a brilliant experience. We had an amazing leader back at the time. And then in 2013, that was really where this sort of stuff kicked into play. And I was offered the chance to start a company called Bloomreach, which at the time no one had heard of. It was a complete startup. We had a small amount of revenue in America and zero revenue here. And Bloomreach was the company who had tried and failed with an AE first in London. Okay, so I came in. Actually, in that case, the AE had departed, and then we grew the team underneath me. So we did it, I felt, in a really, really sensible way. We grew slowly. I think the team was about 5 or 6 for the first year. And then it sort of, we went from there. And I spent 7 years there. By the time I'd left, there was about 120 people in Europe. We'd bought a company in Amsterdam. It was a full blown thing. And it's a lovely, lovely thing for me to look back at these guys. I've still got lots of friends at the company, and they are flying. They're doing so well. And they've got literally hundreds of people just in Europe now alone. So that's a really nice thing for me to look back upon. After that, I was then asked to do the same thing again for a company that is just crazy. And probably we could do a podcast on this company on its own. For those of you that remember, I ran Europe for a company called Fast, which was a one-click payments company. So pretty cool. Unbelievable marketing. At one time, for sure, it was the hottest ticket in Silicon Valley, like without a question of a doubt. And I was running Europe for them. We had $120 million of funding. And again, grew the European region from nothing, had an unbelievable time doing it. But the big difference, Richard, as you know, was this company sadly went pop and literally had to shut down. So we grew to about 40 people. The Europe organization was by far the most successful in terms of signings and any metric you could care to mention. But very sadly, we were caught in that point between grow at all costs and profitability. And then they rather foolishly made the decision to employ 1,000 people, most of which were in the States, which was just a moment. So sadly, that company no longer exists. But again, from a leadership perspective, like leading a company through a shutdown is something that teaches you a lot about yourself, teaches you a lot about real leadership, and it's just a journey. I actually wouldn't change it because it just introduced me to a whole new different set of people and investors and all that sort of stuff. And then I've run another company within the e-commerce space as a GM, but coming into a team that already existed. So that's a slightly different capacity. And then hopefully, touch wood, I'm just about to start another journey growing something here. But yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Well, by the
So
time
that's my
we
experience.
might have some news, right? Well,
Yeah.
I don't think it's that credible, Michael Abodji. We could have found someone better, What I really love about that is particularly with Bloomreach, that's a brand that I love the sort of branding of the company. Like, I really love it. And it's just so familiar. And the fact that, to find the person who was the first real, accelerator and catalyst of that growth is just phenomenal. I know it would have been a huge team effort, but to go from you to 120, what sort of revenue was it by the time that you left?
So when I left, we were doing globally probably, I want to say 60, 70 million. And the European team was just about 45% of that. So, we'd done a really good job. And it's hard to compare, what does your company make revenue versus what does your company make revenue when you're in a different industry or you're selling to different people. But I think when the growth curve looks like that, you've got a really happy team, you've got great product market fit, you've got an unbelievable culture. That to me is what success looks like. I think it, obviously on the balance sheet, everybody looks at revenue and growth, of course. But when you walk away and you think about what have you done individually and what have you done collectively, you don't necessarily think about the revenue first. You think about the relationships that you've made or the impact you've had for your customers, right? So So yeah, thanks for saying that. It was an awesome journey. Yeah, I'm very proud.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think that the fact you also got this experience, the stormy seas, is really powerful, because if you've just done like this was a wicked success story, I think people should take people out for dinner who've had failures, and like learn from them. And I think that also there should be like way more speakers that go on the speaker circuit who talk about failures.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit, didn't we? I must admit, I'm really passionate on this topic because it drives me nuts when interviews happen and people just expect either an AE or a leader to have just seen growth in every single quarter that they've been in business. I mean, to me, that is the very definition of madness. Like, no one's. I just don't believe that everybody's had that. Yes, of course, some people would have had that. Of course they will. But the reality is, sales looks like this. It's volatile, especially in the startup environment. And I think people do shy away from the failures. And as a leader who hires a lot, I actively look for those stories, because I think it tells you more. Excuse me. It tells you more about an individual to see how they've overcome certain things. And also, maybe this is an unpopular opinion, I have interviewed multiple people who have not been that great at sales, but they've been selling something that had a great product market fit, so the numbers look good. And equally, the opposite is true, where you see the amazing candidates who've struggled because either the company or the product market fit in that region was not as good. But it doesn't make them bad salespeople or bad leaders.
Yeah.
So you're right. It's sorry, my bad chest. I think it is something that industry needs to really get to grips with, and people do need to be brave on platforms like LinkedIn to feel like they can talk about this stuff. And I think there are actually a few people now starting to do it. There's an amazing guy who I follow, who I'll put in the bio when in the link when we release this, who talks about the positives and negatives a lot, and he's amazing. So I'd recommend following him. So
Okay.
I'll put it in the chat.
Amazing. So, well, let's definitely lace in some of that failure experience, because I think I learned more from failures than I have from successes. They stick in your mind much more. And you talk about like hiring for the right sort of qualities, that grit or tenacity, but I think it starts with being super self-analytical and having a high amount of self-awareness. And the amount of people I speak to who their ego is borderline deluded. And what I mean by that really is the stories that they tell are so baked into protecting ego rather than steering towards vulnerability and shared perspective through failure. I can sniff it out in a heartbeat, and I find it really fascinating that is kind of what business is optimized for in interviews. They're looking for this perfect candidate rather than trying to find people who have learned hard-learned lessons.
Yeah, it is a challenge, isn't it? Because perfection doesn't exist. And I just think you've got to look to human nature. Like, I'm always very drawn to the people, like, as we've just been saying on LinkedIn, who are a bit more vulnerable, who talk about things that they're not good at, things that they struggle with. And it's important because we are all human at the end of the day. There's no such thing as the perfect leader in every single situation.
Yeah, or the perfect hire. Exactly. So let's talk about culture. I know you mentioned it there, and there's, I suppose, a couple of elements to that. There's like what you look for. There's who you hire, and then there's like what environment you create for them. So maybe we talk about what you look for. So are you looking for someone with experience? Are you looking for an athlete? Talk me through, when you're hiring salespeople particularly, what type of characteristics and criteria you have.
So you mentioned a word that I love. And certainly back in the day at Bloomreach, when we were growing the team and it was early stage, we took a decision to go out there and hire best of the best young talent. Now that sort of sounds like, well, doesn't everybody do that? But I'll break it down, because it was actually a really, really smart thesis behind it. Because specifically we did this for our SDR team. Now, hands up, this was back in the days where an SDR team was mandatory. everybody had one, it still worked, all that stuff, right? But what we did at Bloomreach in the early days was we hired a series of young rock stars. Okay, now they weren't typical hires for an SDR in that they wanted to work in tech and they wanted to kind of become an AE. We literally went out there deliberately and tried to find and approach people who hadn't thought about a career in tech, probably who were high flyers from a university or college. They were probably going to be ending up at Bain or Boston Consulting or one of the consulting groups. And we'd try and intercept them before they join these companies. And we'd say to them, look, the chances are that in 5 years' time, you're probably going to try and move to tech and get into startup world. We'd like to shortcut that process and we'll just offer you the job now. And that was literally the pitch. And it worked in spectacular fashion. And I haven't really seen a company that was as dedicated to that before or since. And I would really like to do that again because it worked so well for us. And I'll give you an example. 3 or 4 of these people started as SDRs. They just thought about the problem in such a creative manner. They were so smart and gifted. They all succeeded massively. All of them then went on to do other great things for Bloomreach. But then what's more interesting to me, because I'm in touch with all of these guys still, is that they've all started to have unbelievable careers that are far better than anything I've ever done or could ever do as well. So they've just sort of launched off these amazing careers. Like Ivan Landabasso, who I was talking to this morning, started as an SDR at Bloomreach, is now an investor in Barcelona. Okay, doing unbelievably well. Alice Wyatt, she started as an SDR at Bloomreach and is now a global head of marketing. Okay, we've got a couple of others. One of them started as an SDR at Bloomreach and is now the general manager of Zuora US. Like, massive job. And then another one, Clint Burgess, it started as an SDR at Bloomreach and is now basically the CEO of his own startup in the AI space. Just like unbelievable. And what that did for us at the time was it just completely changed the game because it, like a rising tide lifts all boats. It lifted all of us, even though these guys were like 25 at the time. It was amazing and it really, really worked. And it's something I would like to replicate again at companies that I start up at that level. And I think looking for talent like that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because obviously as they grow in the company, they're looking for like-minded people, birds of a feather, all of that stuff. And I've always found, like, if you get the cultural values right early stage and you hire to those, then it just becomes very easy to repeat them, which as a British person is quite hard for me to say because we're obviously very cynical and, we take the piss out of these kinds of things all the time. But, it's that acceptance that if you're going to create a culture that's really, really successful globally, you have to have your kind of corporate global culture really, really set. But then also you need to develop your own local geo culture that's going to really foster that togetherness. And I must admit, I do see the best international teams. Often Europe does have that. I think we're quite good at that.
What does great culture mean to you?
To me, it's that feeling of togetherness. It's that feeling where that you would walk through brick walls for each other. I think without great culture, that just does not happen. And I think it has to come from the top, but then is supported by the team moving forwards. And what I mean by that is the leadership, not just the local leadership, but the CEO has to kind of set the tone and lead by example. But then the culture of the company should just flow very, very naturally. I think it's one of those things where if you don't have good culture, it's so obvious and it's so jarring. that it then becomes this kind of wall of negativity. But if you have good culture, people just like coming to work and they don't talk about it. They're just in it and they're flowing, and it has a natural feeling to it. And yeah, I always just come back to that phrase, you know, when people will walk through brick walls or crawl over broken glass to get something done, they enjoy it. It's just, it's just them.
Yeah, it's true. And I think most businesses don't have good culture. Candidly, they all think they do. They all say they do. They put their values and cultures up on the wall, but fundamentally, people don't like working there. And one of the big symptoms is you're not getting a high level of like referral friends, which should be your biggest recruitment source, right? Shouldn't it? Like we had like 70% when I worked in this business that grew from like 45 to 450 people globally with incredible culture. Like 70% of our hires came from internal referrals, and it was faster and cheaper and easier, and we got incredible people from all over the world.
I think it is the acid test, isn't it? And it's the opposite is true. If your culture isn't good, then people won't ask friends or ex-colleagues to come and join them. They just won't do it. It just drops off a cliff. So I think you're right. I think that is usually the main sign of good culture. Yeah,
I think it's huge. Yeah, and then progression. Like I know. So what it makes me think of a lot is my own example of this story where I developed for a company, started as an SDR in 2007, became a manager after a year, and then was part of a global growth of a business, becoming a business unit director. And the hiring and culture part of that leadership journey was my favorite bit. And we used to hire people. We'd bring a group of like pre-vetted candidates from our finder friends, as well as like some agencies and our internal team, into what we called a recruitment presentation. So we'd invite candidates in where we effectively sold to them first. They'd get a walk around the office and like they're getting people like going, "Hey, how are you doing? You're all right." So immediately they love it straight away. We didn't tell people to do that. It was just the culture. We saw people coming in as growth and opportunity rather than risk, and their thing to, sometimes you walk through an office and people go, "Who's that?" And we would bring them in after this tour and tell them the story of like the vision of the business. Like we're a UK business. We're going to grow globally. We're just about to open in Barcelona. We've got dreams of the US. I was like, that's my goal. I'm going to do that one day. We're going to open in APAC. Here are some examples of successful people through the business who started in the position that you are today. By the way, one of us is now the MD. One of them is going to set up Barcelona. And we talked about the criteria that we had, which was we hire three things: capability, desire, and stamina. And after that presentation, the psychology flipped, and it was about them fighting to win a place in the business. Because I think we tapped on a lot of the psychology, and no one else did that. They went resume, interview, screen and vet, get in, And a lot of people chose us because our interview process was harder. And because we created that desire up front. I know you mentioned Rockstar. So if I could just unpick that, what is the criteria or the characteristics that were the patterns of your highest performing salespeople?
Yeah, I think with sale, yeah, okay. Good question. So I think Rockstar, I cringe a bit having used that word, because when I see people write it, it's like rocket ship. It's like it's an overused word in SaaS. The
last thing I want to put on a rocket ship is a bunch of rock stars.
Yeah. I think yeah, it is about characteristics. All salespeople are different. All people are individuals, right? And what makes one good person driving revenue may be completely different from another person. Like if I look at myself when I was an IC, I'm a big thinker, macro guy. I'm this sort of the jazz hands, if you will, of the team. And I was never the bookish, hyper detailed technical seller. That just wasn't who I was, but I was really, really successful, and that's okay. You've got to really look to everybody's core strengths. And I think I really like what you've done in that company. And I really, really respect and hopefully have done that myself, in that, firstly, regardless of how good people are or not, when you're looking at their background or their CV, you've got to make them want to join your company. I really, really, really agree with you there. I think the job of selling your company to a candidate is absolutely the number one job of a VP or a GM or anybody running a team. But I really passionately believe that. And then I think if you can do that it makes it much easier then to draw out people's strengths. And I think by the same token, Richard, you know this better than anybody, you never know for sure, right? Like what we said earlier, you see people who drove loads of revenue at certain companies who probably aren't great salespeople, but they got good numbers. And equally, you know, the really good people who you think could be good, but were just in the wrong company, right? Whenever you hire a person and you think they could be a rock star, you never know for sure. It is always going to be a punt. That is what hiring is in a revenue situation. There's no guarantee, unfortunately. You know, all investors and CEOs wish there was. And sometimes they drill down the recruitment process to the point where it just becomes impossible to hire everybody. I've worked for a CEO who did that all the time. You've got to take a punt. But I think when you've had a lot of experience, you do tend to see these characteristics bubble up to the surface more often than not. And it's usually the things that you guys all know about. You know, it's that natural inquisitiveness. It's the natural ability to want to know why, you know, to ask constant questions. I think these days, you know, there's probably more of an emphasis on the sort of project management detail side of things. There just is, you know, but that's helped a lot by a lot more of the tooling that we have. But I think, yeah, hiring the best is the hardest, but also most important thing that you can do as a leader. But also, like, think to what I said about what we did at Bloomreach. If you think about the problem differently, and you literally go after people who are, you know, ex-Oxford candidates who are going to join Boston Consulting Group, hopefully you know that they're going to, you know, at least have a bigger brain capacity. So you're already off to a better starting point than you would have been.
Yeah, hungry, humble, and
Just
smart.
an idea, just an order. Yeah.
So it's the other one that I had Brent Holloway, a good friend of mine. He said hungry, humble, smart, which is another criteria. So I think a lot of people have coined these things. I've got a new one I'm playing around with for the ICs because I've got my leadership one, which is core. But one it's called GRIT for ICs: growth mindset, resourcefulness, inquisitiveness, and tenacity. And I think that is it. But it's all behaviors and attitudes. And there's some data that 89% of mishires, this is from Sequoia, are down to attitude and cultural misalignment.
Yeah. Massive.
And only 15% of businesses have got a clearly defined set of behaviors that make someone a successful hire. So most people throw Rockstar out willy-nilly. And what they really mean is, we really like them and they've got our experience, but experience is overrated, particularly if you're hiring for SDR level, early stage talent, where they don't have the black book, they don't have the sales track record. All you have is that smarts and that adaptability, but also there's that soft thing that you only learn as a leader who's hired people and had the failures. When you're doing the pitch bit, do they light up? You know, because if the whole process is, we need you to meet our criteria, we're going to screen and vet you, and then we're going to test you, and then we're going to do another test, and then you're going to speak to 5 other people who are all just trying to test you. You never have that chance to actually talk about the vision, talk about the challenge, and see what happens in the whites of their eyes.
So much of what we do is about psychology. And I think this gets talked about too little, actually. Completely agree with everything you just said. I think the best people at hiring are the ones that get this just instinctively, which is a bit unfair, isn't it? Because everybody needs to hire well. So like, not everybody can do things instinctively. It's like sports, isn't it? Not everybody can do what, you know, Yamal does at Barcelona. Like, it's just not possible. Some people will naturally be good at it and other people won't be. So I think during your processes, if you can draw out that and, you know, do things like interview with panels, make sure you're getting people to meet you multiple times. You know, there's no, it's not a secret of why Google are so famous for doing so many interviews. It's because they want to get the whole picture of the person, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying everybody's got that kind of time on their hands, but I do agree with them. I think the psychology of it is great. That stat from Sequoia does not surprise me in the slightest. In the slightest.
But it's the opposite of how most businesses behave, right?
Yeah,
which is interesting. And obviously the culture, you know, if you get a set of the right, like, aligned attitudes and behaviors, then what people do and how they show up and what they value.
You mentioned that we've talked about in my current business for the last year a lot. You talked about growth mindset. You it's amazing how many people in a larger organization actually don't have a growth mindset because maybe the role is a bit safer, or maybe they've been doing a bit more account management. This stuff is absolutely crucial when you're in growth mode, or when you're in, series A, B, C, for sure. It's just a non-negotiable, but you have to smell it. People have either got it or they haven't.
So let's take culture. So one thing we did in our business when we grew globally is that we planted some excellent people from different roles into different regions to inject the DNA. And we made an acquisition as a business, actually a couple, and we did the same thing. We called it injecting the DNA of our business. And I did that exact thing, spent a year over in Miami when we grew that business unit. And I spent some time in our Barcelona office when we were first setting that up in 2009. One of my favorite experiences as a sort of young first-time manager going out and leading a team over there. What's your view on if businesses do already have people who are like very much cultural champions of the business, sending them over as part of the growth in different regions?
I love it, and I've seen it work really well. I'll give you an example. Again, I'll use the Bloomreach example because it's just such a classic thing, replicating what you personally were injected. Over to America and Spain, we did it the other way around. So when we started Bloomreach in Europe, we literally had 0 revenue, and in America they had a decent amount with decent customers, and so a lot of good selling had been happening. It worked out what works, but it also worked out what didn't work. And so I was really, really, really fortunate. I'm going to say his name. He probably never watched this, but he'd be embarrassed to
Tag him.
wherever he does. A guy called Rob Lawrence was by far the most successful AE. And he was one of our reps in the West Coast. He was living in San Francisco out of our Mountain View office. He'd had an unbelievable run of success. He'd won some of the biggest deals the company had done. And I was fortunate enough to persuade him. Well, I didn't really persuade him that hard. He really wanted to move to London. Okay. But I did persuade him to come and join our team. And I was really, really fortunate that the company supported that move. And I would say the benefit for us was absolutely unbelievable because there's 0 ramp time. We just gave him a bunch of leads and he ran with them. And I think within, a month or so, he closed his first deal in Europe. It was ridiculous. He helped train all of us in terms of what was working and not working. As I said, they knew exactly what the pitfalls were. It was just a massive, massive lift for the company. And then what's more is he decided to stay, then became our consistent top performer. And actually, he's still there today. He's literally still at Bloomreach now, crushing his number, quarter in, quarter out. So Rob was amazing for us, but also in terms of the culture. Like, he took what was really working from a culture perspective from America, helped us kind of shape what that meant for us in London, and then became one of the biggest supporters of what that meant. And it was just amazing. It was really, really good. And also Rob really threw himself into, living in London and, what it was to be an American over here, and, all that stuff. And we, I hope, supported him through that journey too. So it's just a really, really nice story of where it really, really worked amazingly well. And it's brave. You will know, having done it yourself, like, it takes real bravery to do it. But I think the people that do it, you need to have a moment in your life where you can travel, and people with kids and wives or husbands, it's harder for sure. But if you can do it, I think it can be unbelievably rewarding for your career. I mean, how did you find it? Was that your
best? Yeah, it's my favorite part of the whole journey was going and spending time in different business units. So Auckland and Barcelona and America. I absolutely loved it. And we regularly bring people from those offices to our HQ, which is what I ran, to spend time. So if we hire an external manager, for example, into the business, which we tried to promote internally, probably 85% of our managers were internal promotions. But when we did hire it externally, we would bring those managers to work 3 months in our HQ to learn the DNA that way around. but I loved the experience culturally, what you pick up by living in a different country, working with different people. And it's such a nice way to move. Like, I think I got, obviously the company pays for it. So like, you don't have to worry about like getting accommodation, any of that sort of stuff. You're going into a business where you're the expert, where it's a group of new people who are looking at you for leadership and for knowledge, and you get that chance to like have fun with people and grow and help people to achieve things that they couldn't achieve before. And I absolutely loved it. And we're working right now with Pendo, and one of the so brilliant company, and a woman, a lady called Jess Valentine. She was 18 when she started. And she spent some time in our business unit in the UK when she first started. She was in Barcelona, and then she traveled over to APAC. She spent time there. She lived in Miami for a bit, and then she worked about a year in my business unit as well. So when I'm talking to candidates about Jess and the fact that she would be their manager, I get to say, like, we've come through the same school of sales, and she had this international experience. And you can see people's eyes light up, because the idea that you could join a company and not only develop in your career, but also travel internationally is unbelievably attractive. And I think if you really want the best talent in the world, they have that adventurous spirit.
Only I do agree with that. And yeah, we one of the younger guys that I talked about earlier in this episode, Ivan, who's Spanish, he actually did it the other way around. I mean, he was really brave. He traveled to Silicon Valley to go and find a job at a tech company, which turned out to be Bloomreach, did so well, and then came back to Europe at Bloomreach, which was a really nice journey for him. But there's other benefits too. I remember Rob always he's a very funny guy, right? He always used to talk about the differences in selling to British people than selling to American people. But actually, I mean, it was unbelievably helpful for me as a leader, because I could literally get Rob to say his piece to my CEO to be like, look, actually, it isn't the same as just pitching up to a US retailer and, doing the pitch. And, or we have to think about the idiosyncrasies or the slight differences in language or the slight differences in buying signals that the UK audience has versus the US. And I'm not saying it needs to be completely different, but with Rob's evidence of that himself, it really, really helped us change and tweak things. And I mean, he always used to make me laugh. He always used to say, oh my God, like when I go to these meetings with all these Brits, I have got no idea whether they love me or they hate me. All I do is sit there and smile.
If they're being mean, they like you. If they're like nodding heads, then they hate you. You're going to get ghosted.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the cultural differences. By the way, I love this. Like this whole topic, we could definitely I love the story format. But let's talk about the topic of the differences. Like, if we think about, in your experience, what are maybe some of the misconceptions about how different it will be to, create growth in a different region than it is just continuing to grow in the country that you were founded?
Yeah, I think it is often the case where companies just expect it to keep growing at the same rate. If you hire good people, just plant this product here and off you go, right? And look, sometimes that does work, of course. I think there's the people, as we've just been saying, people are slightly misguided though, even with a change from just US to UK. Sometimes it works, you get a home run, no problem, right? But depending on the product or the industry, there are differences. There are real differences. I worked, as I said, in e-commerce for a long time. And I've worked in basically the back end space of e-commerce. So logistics, okay? If you think about the US when it comes to logistics, there are 5 or 6 organizations, UPS, DHL, FedEx, etc., who will deliver your package somewhere in the US. Fine, great, no problem. You've also got one currency, okay? This is just one example, because there's like a million examples like this where software companies will have differences in Europe and US. But with logistics, it's a really easy example. take the UK then. Well, how many ways of delivering a package have we got in the UK? Well, we've got Royal Mail. We've also got FedEx and DHL and UPS. Okay, tick, tick. But we've probably got another 50 companies beyond that. We've got third-party logistics organizations. Then we've got France, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Spain, all these other countries. They've all also got 100 different organizations that can deliver your package, different currencies, different languages. So the problem that we were trying to solve, that organization where I worked in, is just exponentially harder in Europe. And any software company will probably have an example that they could point to where that might be the case. So it can never just be about, oh, we'll put a leader and a salesperson in this region and they will be successful because we've done it here. And the same would be true the other way around, you know, Europe to the US. You have to think about, well, what does that actually mean for the local audience? And unfortunately, and I'm sure you've heard this one quite a few times, unfortunately, particularly when you go to mainland Europe, there is a sensitivity that the European teams need to be aware of, that you're not just trying to push the American product or the American software. And I know that's quite, I did think whether I should even say that, because it can be quite insulting to a US company. But I've literally heard that hundreds of times from customers.
Yeah, I think it dies before it dies in marketing.
Yeah.
If you try and send out, you go, oh, well, you know, the Swedish, they speak British, you know, or so they speak English. You send out like a English product spec or a white paper, or invite them to a webinar and it's just in English, you're screwed. You try and do that in Germany or France, you'll be blacklisted as a company never to work with again, isn't it? It's like, it starts way earlier.
I think it's, and that's why when a company comes from the US to London, it's same but different, right? But then when you go to France or Germany, gosh, you really do need to think about the local native speaking, the language, the ways of behaving, the manners of having a meeting face to face versus online. You know, all this stuff comes into play in a way that, unless you've got locals from that region, you're playing a guessing game.
How often do you see that the businesses are trying to cover Europe with English speakers? So talk me through like the importance of native language and native culture.
It's a really, really hard one, because there's so many things that can drive that decision: cost, offices, where people are physically, how do you support them? So, gosh, and I don't really know whether I'm wedded to one particular way or another, because I've seen it work and fail in every sort of combination, right? I think it's always nice to imagine a world where, if you are selling internationally and you're selling to the main markets in Europe, that you can at least have a local presence. And that's always a nice thought, okay? And it's an even nicer thought if you can speak their language, okay? And obviously, it stands to reason that the customers that you win in those regions will appreciate you more and probably have a better relationship with you as a vendor. And I think that is true, right? The challenges that come with that, though, are, well, how do you support those people locally? And where physically are they located? Because also you then introduce challenges, right? You may have, I'll just make up some numbers, you may have a team of 20 or 30 people in London who are quite settled. And then you've got 2 or 3 people in France, or 2 or 3 people in Germany. Now that may work amazingly well, but those guys will also have the challenge of feeling like they're alone, or feeling like they're less supported somehow, or feeling like, you know, the website's not in German, or this case study is only in English, or, you know, you've only got a long list of US examples to throw to my customers in Germany who don't feel like they've got anything common. There's always a challenge that you have to overcome. So it can work really, really well, but it's hard. The other way to do it, which I have seen, I've shrunk an organization back from mainland Europe. You know, I started and we have people all over the place, and we actually shrunk it all back to London, which is purely and simply about cost. We can't afford all these people. We've got to have a smaller team. Right. We're going to try and do it in English language from London. And I think great on the balance sheet, and EBITDA probably looked a lot better. 2 thumbs up. But what we then suffered from, unsurprisingly, was a hit in retention rate, and slightly disgruntled customers. So it's a really hard one. It's a double-edged sword. I think one of my good friends in the industry, Jim Herbert, who runs a great company called Patchworks, I think he always talks about like the trifecta, where he's like his perfect mix. When he lands in a region, he'd have a strong AE, a strong SC, and a partnerships person. And he said, with that sort of combination, you can do a lot of damage, and they can be pretty self-sufficient. And I tend to agree with him. So if I ever do it, that's usually the model I try and sell.
Yeah, makes sense. I think what I've seen work really well is working with partners. They've already got the regional presence. They've already got the languages. It's why people chose to work with our agencies, because we basically had Europe under one roof. Oh, you want to do Germany? You want like 0.2 FTE, like 1 day a week of a Finnish person. We have a Finnish person, and they can work on your campaign for that amount of time. That was really effective. And often businesses would use that as we're looking to land in Europe. We want to generate leads for these salespeople that we're putting into region. Maybe we're putting some SE and stuff, but we need them to have pipeline, because we know that if we're trying to give them the job of being a full 360 rep in a brand new region, then it's going to be impossible. So if you can help us to generate opportunities for them and connect marketing and sales, and be like the interface between US marketing and then local delivery, then that was a really big reason why we scaled so fast. And often we were replacing where they tried to have like a local lead gen or SDR, or be trying to do it from the US. And it was a real struggle for them, because you want that first person that ever speaks to a customer to make a really big impact. And if you're trying to do that in second language, I think it's incredibly difficult.
It is. And I don't think anyone's really solved that yet. Obviously, newer tools are making that easier, for sure. But I think that also creates a whole different set of problems that no one's really even thought about yet. You could do an amazing outreach campaign with AI in all sorts of languages. But if that really starts working, what do you do? What do you do then? You've got 3 people who don't speak languages sat in an office in London somewhere. So yeah.
Let's say, so if you have, let's say someone's moved a team, so they've got a team out there, they maybe got some office space, but they want to keep them connected to the business. So they're trying to organize global calls, maybe it's global team meetings, maybe it's board meetings. I remember one of my frustrations in the role of being a director in different business units around the world is sometimes you have to join a 3:30 in the morning board call, or like expect people to turn up to a 9 p.m, all hands meeting or training call for the managers. And obviously it didn't work. But the intention was good and the intention was pure. What's your experience of some of the mistakes that people make with time zones?
I mean, I've had similar experiences, Richard. I think partly you have to understand it kind of comes with the territory. So you will be expected to do things out of hours. That's just normal, fine. But I think there needs to be a separation between you as a leader and what your sort of your perception of what right and wrong looks like in terms of your personal life versus your team. It's not the same. Like, I think leaders, yeah, for sure. Like, you have to accept that that's going to be a thing, but it works both ways. And I think I would always be far more happy about doing it, staying up late or getting up early, as long as, very simply, the people that I'm talking to in the other region have called that out and recognized that, oh, I appreciate you jumping on this call. Like, just a simple, message. It just makes me feel, okay, well, yeah, that's fine. I don't mind doing it. Thanks. We like forecast calls. This is a classic one, often take a couple of hours once a week with the chief revenue officer. My favorite ever CRO, DJ, did it on a Thursday night, UK time, because he said, look, I want to do it on Thursday night because otherwise Michael's going to be on a call until 7:30, 8 o'clock on a Friday evening, and that's not fair on him. We would never do that if it was just the US team. I always it's just a small gesture. I always really appreciated. But I think when it comes to the wider team, you do need to be really conscious of it. And I think the best companies are the ones that will be cognizant of that. And if it's an all hands, they'll do it at a time that's pretty okay for most people. But I think when you've got a truly global company, unfortunately, some areas do suffer. Like, if you've got an Indian team, a European team, and a US team, that's always very hard to get all three regions on the same call. So I think the best sort of feedback and the best culture comes where they've taken that into an account, and they'll do an Indian US call, which will be at a different time to the US European call. So they'll literally do it twice, which I always really appreciated that. But when it's not working because it just becomes unmanageable. I think companies that are based in Australia and then have a European office, that's often really challenging.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think that maybe you've got 100 people in the US and then 5 in the UK, they don't need the same meeting cadence, and they don't need the same volume of meetings because there's less to organize. Probably you need to design the meeting structure very clearly around, is this achieving a purpose for the business? And if it's not achieving a purpose and you're not really clear exactly who needs to be in it, why do it? And what could we send them ahead of time? I think that I really like the Amazon example where Jeff Bezos sends out a six-page report to people that they've got to read through before they go to the meeting, and then they discuss it, rather than going in and then they use that time to do the brief. Respect people's time. And if there's not value in the meeting, Elon Musk says, get out. You have the ability to walk out of the meeting if it's not there. And I think that a lot of meetings can feel like prisons, particularly on remote calls where people are just on mute with the camera off. They're not wanting to be there. They're wanting to be somewhere else, but you have to be there. Otherwise you'll be punished.
Yeah. There's some great stuff around nowadays, like people advising leaders to be just much more selfish with their time. And as you say, just having the courage to say, look, this is not effective, or this isn't driving revenue, therefore I'm going to decline this meeting. And I do think that's okay. You should never be offended by that. So, yeah.
So let's bring this all home then. So if we think about, from your experience, the biggest do's, let's say that let's say there's a few people listening to this, they're executives or they're founders of international businesses, they're looking to land in Europe, they're looking to break open the UK. What would be your golden do's to make that a successful landing?
So I think do massively consider that Europe is different. That's one of my top ones. It is different. It is not the same. As long as you've got that in your mind, that's good enough. Okay. But do not go into this just thinking, plop, we've got people there, it's going to be a success. That is never going to work. Do make sure that you treat your European leader in a slightly different way than you treat your US sales leaders. Just give them a bit more space, give them a bit more air cover, and let them breathe. Just know that they've probably got a lot more on their plate and on their mind than your other sales leads, just by very virtue of the fact that they're usually the most senior person in region. And there's a matrix structure 90% of the time, which means they're managing people who don't necessarily report to them. That's a real issue. Every one of my friends that does leadership roles always complains about the same thing. So as long as the mothership understands that, great. I would say do, if you can, hire those athletes that I talked about. I just don't see people really making the effort. Everyone says that they do, but I think if you really, really can find people that act and think differently, that's amazing. But like I said, I just don't see enough people doing it. So, that's a tough one. And I think the other big do is as we talked about ad nauseam, is do consider moving talent around. If you've got someone that's willing to do it, that is the quickest and easiest way that you're going to get ramped. You're going to ramp other people, and you're going to bring what works into a region really, really quickly.
Yeah. I also think do sell it up front, and it's like something we clicked on, and I totally believe that most businesses miss this part. Their recruitment process is a buying process, not a selling process. But it's a two-way buying process.
Of course, because culture starts at the interview, not when you start the company. It starts the first time you meet someone that represents that company. Yeah, I completely agree.
I think if you've got a senior person meeting candidates, talking about the vision, talking about what we stand for, talking about what they can achieve, talking about the global growth opportunities, showing examples of people who've done that journey that before that they can emulate, then you've got a brilliant example that's going to stick in people's minds. That's so different from job ad, screening call, assessment, final interview, final interview, offer, which is how most businesses would operate.
Yeah. And it's human nature, isn't it? Like the best candidates will hopefully be thinking, well, sell me the job so I know that I actually then want to put in 100% effort for your interview process. That's certainly how I think. I'm like, well, why would I put in maximum effort to something I'm not even sold on yet? That doesn't make sense to me. But if you sell me it's great, and I believe that that's something I want to go and do, well, yeah, I will crawl over broken glass for you, Mr. Employer. So yeah,
it's the applicant like prophecy. You know, we've got 500 applicants. I'm like, this is literally like 500 incredibly lukewarm hand raisers that also raised their hand to 50 other people that same day. It's like, you know, I've got all this pipeline. I'm like, you haven't done it. You haven't got anything until you've got people that would literally choose you over the competition.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your experience.
The pleasure has been all mine. It's been lots of fun.
Well, I appreciate you coming on when you're not feeling 100%. That's you know, proper, like, you know, inject you in the region. You've got grit. Amazing. Michael, thank you so much. Everyone else will see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this conversation, we've got a newsletter called Growth Magnet on LinkedIn, where we take the best insights from all of these episodes and turn them into bite-sized format for you to enjoy.